The most dangerous person in the room wasn't the Mafia boss with the dragon tattoos. It was the waitress trembling with adrenaline, holding a Glock 19 over his dinner plate. Everyone else saw a loyal inner circle sharing a toast. Only the waitress knew it was an execution. The signal had already been tapped on the wine glass. The knives were already loose in their sleeves. And if she hesitated for a single heartbeat, the King of Soul would be dead before the appetizer was served. So, she did the one thing that guaranteed chaos. She became the threat. The barrel of her gun was already locked on his lieutenant's chest. The restaurant looked serene, filled with candlelight and soft jazz, designed to hide dirty business. But Zariah Mitchell saw the geometry of the trap. Not because she was a spy, not because she was fearless, but because she was the help, and nobody hides their secrets from the furniture. Only the invisible see the knife before it cuts. If you understand why she pulled the trigger, you're ready for what comes next. Stay with me until the end, because the name she drops in the next 5 seconds changes the target from the waitress to the man sitting at his right hand. Before the truth comes out, don't forget to like this video. Hit subscribe and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get started. 10 minutes before the gun was drawn, the air in the private dining room smelled of jasmine tea, expensive cologne, and the heavy, copper scent of impending violence. Zariah moved through the shadows of the Jade Lotus like a ghost in a pressed white shirt and fitted vest. She was a phantom limb of the service industry, necessary, present, but completely ignored until a glass needed refilling. That was her advantage. Men like Kong Min-jae didn't lower their voices when the help was nearby. They assumed she was deaf to their sins. Kong sat at the head of the marble table, a king holding court in a castle made of glass. He was relaxed, his suit jacket unbuttoned, exposing the edge of the dragon ink creeping up his neck. He laughed at a joke, a deep, booming sound that shook the crystal stemware, completely unaware that he was the punchline. He believed he was surrounded by brothers. Zariah, refilling the water glasses with practiced invisibility, saw only wolves waiting for the alpha to stumble. She moved to the left side of the table, the bottle wrapped in a white napkin. Park Do-hyun sat there, the man closest to the boss. He wasn't laughing. His fingers were drumming a frantic, silent rhythm on the white tablecloth. Tap, 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 like a countdown. He hadn't touched his appetizer. His eyes weren't on his food. They were darting toward the kitchen entrance, checking the clearance. Zariah poured his water, and Park didn't even blink. To him, she was just a floating hand. But in the reflection of the polished silver platter, Zariah caught the signal. Across the table, Choi Sung-woo, the older man with the slicked-back hair, gave a microscopic nod. It wasn't a gesture of agreement, it was a confirmation. The atmosphere in the room shifted, growing heavier, though the jazz music played on. The warmth seemed to drain out of the space, replaced by a cold, calculating static. Lee Jun-suk, seated at the far end, slowly slid his hand beneath the table, not to adjust his napkin, but to grip something rigid near his waist. The bodyguards by the door were distracted, laughing at something on a phone, paid off or incompetent. The geometry of the table had locked into place. The trap was perfect. The execution was scheduled for the main course, and the victim was currently raising a toast to loyalty, smiling at the men who had already dug his grave. Zariah cradled the bottle of 82 Bordeaux like a fragile artifact, the glass cool against her palm. She stepped into the narrow gap between Park Do-hyun and the boss, a space where the air felt compressed, heavy with the weight of things unsaid. As she leaned in to fill Park's glass, the ruby liquid swirling into the crystal, the proximity forced a revelation. The private room was climate-controlled to a crisp 68 degrees, yet a single, traitorous bead of sweat had broken loose from Park's hairline. It traced a jagged path down his temple, cutting through the matte finish of his skin before disappearing into the starch of his collar. He wasn't hot. He was terrified. His hand, resting inches from his steak knife, gave a microscopic twitch, an involuntary spasm of a man waiting for a bomb to go off. Then the main course arrived. A server placed the heavy porcelain plate before Kang Min-jae with ceremonial reverence. Braised short ribs in a dark, glossy reduction, steaming hot. The aroma was savory, rich with garlic and soy, momentarily overpowering the expensive cologne in the room. But as the heat rose from the meat, the world seemed to tilt on its axis for Zaraya. The steam wasn't white. The image fractured her reality, dragging her mind back 3 years to a humid, shouting kitchen in the bowels of a Macau casino. She was 19, invisible, scrubbing pans while old Chef Chang lectured the line cooks. He had held up a pot of ruined sauce, his face grim and lit by the harsh fluorescent hum. "You see this tint?" he had hissed, tilting the ladle so the overhead light caught the vapor. "This is the reaction. When the alkaloid hits the vinegar reduction under heat, it separates. The steam turns green. Emerald green. You see this, it means the dish is compromised. You serve this, you don't just get fired. You get buried." The memory snapped shut, leaving the cold dread of the present. Zaraya stared down at Kang Min-jae's plate, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. It wasn't a trick of the candlelight. A faint, spectral green haze curled upward from the bubbling sauce, twisting like a serpent before dissipating into the air. It was the color of copper oxidation, the color of sickness, the exact shade Zhang had warned her about. Kang Min-jae picked up his silver chopsticks, the metal glinting. He was still smiling at a joke Choi had made, completely blind to the chemical warning rising beneath his nose. He reached for the meat. Beside him, Park Do-hyun's breathing stopped entirely. The sweat, the twitching hand, the green ghost in the steam, the signal was screaming in a frequency only she could hear. Min-jae's chopsticks pinched the marinated rib, lifting it from the green mist. He opened his mouth to eat, but Zaraya's focus had already snapped away from the food. Her eyes locked onto Park Do-hyun. The lieutenant wasn't waiting for the poison. Perhaps he didn't trust the chemistry, or perhaps his nerves had simply shredded under the pressure. While the boss was distracted by the meat, Park's right hand slid smoothly, almost casually, inside his tailored blazer. It was a movement Zaraya had seen a dozen times in movies, but in reality it was clumsier, desperate. The fabric didn't bunch naturally. It draped over the hard, angular block of a weapon. He was going to double-tap the boss the moment the poison took hold, ensuring there was no antidote, no ambulance, and no survival. The realization hit Zaraya like a physical blow. The logic of the room dismantled itself in her mind. If she screamed, "Gone!" Park would panic and fire blindly, likely killing Min-jae before security could react. If she lunged to knock the food away, the bodyguards at the door, hired muscle trained to see threats, not saviors, would fill her with lead before she hit the floor. Innocence was a liability. Being unarmed was a death sentence. She needed a distraction loud enough to shatter the trance, and a weapon lethal enough to hold the wolves at bay. She didn't think about the cameras. She didn't calculate the odds of losing her job or her life. She simply opened her left hand. Gravity took the silver serving tray. The crash was apocalyptic. The heavy Bordeaux bottle shattered against the Italian marble floor, exploding in a violent spray of red shards and expensive vintage. The sound was a gunshot without the bullet, sharp, jagged, and deafening in the quiet room. Every head in the room snapped toward the noise. Min-jae flinched violently, the sudden shock causing him to drop the poisoned meat onto the table. The bodyguards at the door reached for their earpieces, confused by the lack of muzzle flash. For a fraction of a second, the carefully orchestrated assassination fell apart into pure, unscripted confusion. In that splintered second of chaos, Zaraya moved. Her right hand didn't go for a napkin to clean the mess. It swept behind the small of her back, beneath the hem of her fitted black vest. Her fingers found the cold, textured grip of the Glock 19 she had taped there 3 hours ago. She ripped the weapon free, the friction burning her skin, and slammed her elbows into a locked firing stance. The room froze. The jazz music seemed to strangle itself. Park Do-hyun, caught with his hand halfway inside his jacket, found himself staring down the black bore of the pistol. His eyes went wide, the sweat on his forehead gleaming like oil. Zaraya didn't look at the boss. She didn't look at the bodyguards. She locked her focus entirely on the traitor, her arms rigid, her body leaning over the ruined dinner. The decision was made. The ghost was now the gunman. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. The shattered Bordeaux bled across the white marble floor like a fresh wound, the dark red liquid soaking into the hem of the tablecloth. But no one looked at the mess. The entire room had contracted into a single, razor-sharp triangle of tension: the waitress, the lieutenant, and the Don. Zaraya held her breath, her lungs burning. The Glock 19 felt impossibly heavy in her hand, yet her grip was iron. She wasn't aiming at the room. She was tunneling her vision exclusively onto Park Do-hyun's chest. The traitor sat frozen, his hand trapped halfway inside his jacket, his eyes wide and glassy with the shock of a predator suddenly realizing he is prey. Kang Min-jae sat between them, a king on a throne that had suddenly become a firing range. The shock on his face was slowly curdling into a dark, volatile fury. He didn't scramble for cover. He didn't shout. He simply turned his head, the movements slow and mechanical, to look at the woman standing over his dinner. He saw the help, the invisible girl who poured water and cleared crumbs, now transformed into an angel of death. Her afro was haloed by the dim sconce light, her face stripped of all subservience. She wasn't serving him anymore, she was commanding the space. Min-jae's gaze shifted from the barrel of her gun to his lieutenant. He saw Park's unnatural posture. He saw the sweat glistening on Park's upper lip, heavy and desperate. He saw the hand buried in the jacket, frozen in a gesture that looked nothing like reaching for a wallet, and everything like reaching for a weapon. Confusion warred with instinct in the boss's eyes. The air crackled with unasked questions. Why is the waitress armed? Why is my brother sweating? Who moves first? At the periphery, the two bodyguards by the door had drawn their weapons, the slides clicking forward in unison. The sound was distinct, mechanical, and loud. They were leveling their sights on Zaraya's head, waiting for a single nod from Min-jae to paint the wall with her brains. "Don't," Zaraya whispered. The word was barely breath, but in the vacuum of the room, it landed like a command. She didn't look at the guards. She didn't look at the boss. She kept her aim dead center on Park's heart. "If you move that hand, Park, you die before it clears the lapel." Min-jae's jaw tightened, the muscles bunching. He looked at Park, waiting for a denial, waiting for outrage. But Park said nothing. The silence stretched, thin and brittle, ready to snap. "Drop it!" The head of security roared from the doorway, his voice cracking with the strain. "Drop the weapon or you're dead!" Zaraya didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. To acknowledge the laser sights burning into the back of her skull was to accept death. Her universe had contracted into a single, straight line connecting the front sight of her Glock to the silk tie of the man sweating across the table. "Boss," Zaraya said. Her voice was unrecognizable, flat, hard, stripped of the customer service lilt she had worn for 3 years. "Don't look at me. Look at your brother." Min-jae's eyes darted between the woman threatening his life and the man sitting at his right hand. The betrayal in the room was palpable, a physical weight pressing down on the white tablecloth. "You put a gun at my table," Min-jae growled, the threat low and vibrating in his chest. "Give me one reason why I don't have them peel your skin off right here. Because if I wanted you dead, I wouldn't be talking." Zaraya snapped, risking a step closer. "And if he wanted you alive, his hand wouldn't be on a trigger right now." She shifted her grip, the polymer frame digging into her palm. "Look at his left hand, Min-jae. Look at the way the fabric pulls at the vent. That's not a wallet." That's not a phone. Min-jae went still. The anger in his face cooled into something sharper, more dangerous: calculation. He turned his head slowly toward Park Do-hyun. Park was vibrating. The sweat was no longer a single bead. It was a sheen, slicking his skin like oil. His lips parted, pale and trembling, caught in a rictus of panic. He looked small, suddenly, shrinking under the weight of the king's attention. "Boss," Park stammered, his voice thin and reedy. "She's crazy. She's an assassin. Look at her. Let them shoot her." "Shut up," Min-jae said softly. He didn't look away from Park's midsection. He saw it now. The unnatural weight in the tailored suit pocket. The rigid angle of the wrist buried deep inside the inner lining. It wasn't the relaxed posture of a diner. It was the coiled tension of a viper waiting to strike. The geometry of the suit was wrong. "Take your hand out, Park," Zaraya commanded, her finger tightening on her own trigger. Slowly. 2 fingers. Empty. "She's lying," Park hissed, his eyes darting frantically to the guards, begging for a rescue that wasn't coming. "Kill her. Do it now," I said. Zaraya raised her voice, cutting through his panic like a blade. "Show him the silencer, Park. Or show him the knife. Because we both know you didn't come here to eat." Min-jae's gaze held steady on his lieutenant, but the certainty in his eyes was fracturing. 10 years of blood, shared graves, and silence stood between him and Park Do-hyun. Park knew where the bodies were buried because he had held the shovel. To believe the waitress was to accept that his own right hand had been rotting for years. Park saw the hesitation. He seized it like a lifeline. "Hyungnim," Park whispered, his voice trembling with manufactured outrage. He didn't pull his hand out. Instead, he leaned forward, chest pressing against the invisible line of fire, ignoring the gun pointed at his heart. "Look at her. She's shaking. She's high, or she's a plant sent by the triads to create chaos. Keep your hands where I can see them," Zaraya shouted, but the command lacked the iron it had held seconds ago. Her arms were beginning to burn, the adrenaline turning toxic. "I'm not moving, you crazy bitch," Park spat, never breaking eye contact with his boss. "Think about it, boss. Who is she? A waitress. A nobody. Suddenly she has a Glock and knows about silencers? Since when does the staff carry heat? She's the threat. She's waiting for you to look at me so she can put a bullet in your head." Min-jae's eyes flickered back to Zaraya. The logic was sound. Why did the waitress have a gun? The Spies narrative was invisible. The weapon in her hand was very real. The familiarity of the Brotherhood was reknitting itself, closing ranks against the outsider. "He's playing you," Zaraya pleaded, desperation rising in her throat like bile. "He tapped the glass. He signaled Choi. Check his jacket. I don't check my brothers for wires because the help tells me to," Min-jae sneered. The temperature in the room dropped. He took a step toward Zaraya, placing himself between her and Park, shielding the traitor. "You have 3 seconds to drop the weapon, or my men will turn you into a memory." "Kill her," Park urged from behind the safety of the boss's shoulder, his voice gaining strength. "Do it before she fires. Look at her finger, Hyungnim. She's going to squeeze." The bodyguards shifted their aim, laser sights dancing on Zaraya's forehead. The air in the room grew thin, suffocating. Zaraya felt the cold realization wash over her. She had gambled on the truth, but in this world, truth was weaker than loyalty. She was losing him. The king was protecting the snake, and she was the only target left in the room. Min-jae began the countdown, his voice a low rumble of finalized violence. 1. Zaraya's eyes flickered to the periphery. While Park Do-hyun cowered and the boss postured, the third man at the table had gone unnoticed. Lee Jun-suk, the quiet calculator at the far end, saw the opening. With Min Jae's back turned to him and the security team focused entirely on the waitress, Lee moved. It wasn't a panic move like Park's, it was smooth, professional. His hand slid from the table edge to his waistband, his thumb breaking the retention strap of a concealed holster. 2. Zaraya saw the glint of Lee's weapon. She realized with terrifying clarity that she had no good targets. If she shot Park, the guards would kill her. If she shot Lee, Min Jae would kill her. The truth was invisible, hidden in a sauce reduction that looked delicious and smelled like death. She couldn't argue with gravity, and she couldn't outshoot a room full of professionals. She had to make the invisible visible. 3. Zaraya didn't squeeze the trigger on Park. She dropped her aim 6 inches and fired. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space, a thunderclap that erased all thought. The bullet didn't hit flesh. It struck the center of the porcelain plate sitting in front of Kang Min Jae. The dish disintegrated. Shards of expensive china exploded outward like shrapnel, sending the braised short ribs and the dark, glossy sauce splattering across the pristine white tablecloth. Min Jae flinched back, shielding his face, the deafening ring of the shot leaving the room in a stunned, vibrating silence. But the silence didn't last. Physics took over. The sauce, superheated by the kinetic energy of the bullet and exposed to the sudden rush of air, reacted instantly. The faint wisp of green steam Zaraya had seen earlier erupted. A thick, billowing cloud of noxious, emerald green smoke hissed upward from the ruined food, twisting into the air between the boss and his lieutenant. It was undeniable. It wasn't a trick of the light or a hallucination. The chemical reaction was violent and unnatural, smelling sharply of burnt copper and bitter almonds. The green fog hung suspended in the candlelight, a ghostly wall separating the king from his court. Park Do-hyun froze, his face draining of blood as the toxic cloud drifted past him. Lee Jun-suk stopped mid-draw, his hand hovering over his weapon, his eyes widening as he realized the game was blown. Min Jae slowly lowered his arm. He stared at the mess on the table. He watched the green smoke curl around the shards of the plate he had been seconds away from eating. He breathed in the metallic scent of the poison. The realization hit him harder than a bullet. The waitress hadn't missed. She had saved him from the very meal his brother had urged him to eat. The green mist swirled between them, a toxic curtain that separated the king from his court. Min Jae didn't cough, though the acrid scent of bitter almonds burned his throat. He just stared at the sizzling ruins of his dinner, watching the chemical ghost dance in the air. The evidence was absolute. It wasn't a mistake. It was a murder attempt, elegant and cowardly, served on fine china. Slowly, Min Jae turned his back on Zaraya. He was no longer looking at the woman with the gun. He was looking at the brother who had tried to bury him. Park Do-hyun had stopped shouting. The color had drained from his face, leaving him gray and trembling. He looked at the smoke, then at the boss, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on dry land. There were no more lies to tell. The silence that stretched between them was heavy with 20 years of shared history, now curdled into hate. "You tapped the glass?" Min Jae said softly. It wasn't a question. "You tapped the glass to signal the kitchen. You watched me pick up the chopsticks. You smiled." "Hyungnim," Park wheezed, taking a step back, his hands raising in surrender. "It wasn't me. It was the triads. They forced me." "Liar," Min Jae whispered. The word carried more violence than the gunshot had. At the far end of the table, Lee Jun-suk, the calculator, realized the negotiation was over. He abandoned the pretense of innocence. His hand, still hovering near his waistband, snapped down to draw his weapon. He was fast, faster than the bodyguards, faster than Min Jae. He had a clear line of sight to the boss's head. But he had forgotten the furniture. Mr. Han, the elderly head waiter who had been standing silently by the wine station like a statue, moved with a fluidity that belied his age. He didn't drop a tray or scream. He simply stepped forward, producing a ceramic steak knife from his sleeve with the grace of a magician. In one fluid motion, he drove the blade through the back of Lee's hand, pinning it to the mahogany table before the weapon could clear the holster. Lee screamed, a high, jagged sound that shattered the room's tension. "The service in this establishment is strictly nonviolent, Mr. Lee," Mr. Han said, his voice calm, polite, and terrifyingly steady. He leaned his weight onto the handle of the knife, immobilizing the gunman. "Unless, of course, the guest is rude." Min-jae didn't even flinch at the scream. He kept his eyes locked on Park. The bodyguards, finally realizing who the true threats were, swung their weapons away from Zariah and leveled them at Park and the sobbing Lee. "Put the gun down, Zariah," Min-jae said, without looking back at her. His voice was no longer threatened. It was weary. "You don't need it anymore. You're the only one at this table who isn't trying to kill me." Zariah hesitated, her arms trembling as the adrenaline crash began to hit. She lowered the Glock, but she didn't holster it. She watched as the hierarchy of the Seoul underworld collapsed and rebuilt itself in seconds, all because she had refused to serve the main course. The king was alive, but the feast was over. The removal of the betrayal was as efficient as the service had been all night. Security didn't ask questions. They simply grabbed Park Do-hyun by his tailored collar and Lee Jun-suk by his good arm, dragging them from the room like bags of refuse. Park didn't scream, he just stared at the floor, the weight of 20 years of brotherhood evaporating into silence. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, sealing the violence away, leaving only the faint, lingering scent of burnt copper and the shattered remains of dinner. Mr. Han, ever the professional, quietly collected the broken porcelain and the stained tablecloth, vanishing into the kitchen as if he hadn't just stabbed a man. The room was suddenly vast. The silence was heavy, ringing in Zariah's ears as the adrenaline began to bleed out of her system, leaving her knees weak. She stood alone near the serving station, the Glock 19 hanging heavy in her hand, suddenly feeling ridiculous in her black vest and white shirt. She was a waitress who had just held a gun on the most dangerous man in Seoul. The reality of the infraction hit her. She waited for the anger, for the retribution. Kang Min-jae didn't shout. He walked slowly around the ruined table, his shoes crunching softly on a stray shard of glass. He stopped at his chair, picked up the bottle of water Zariah had placed there an eternity ago, and poured 2 glasses. "Sit," he said. The word echoed in the empty room. Zariah hesitated. "Boss, I should go." "The police." "The police aren't coming," Min-jae interrupted, his voice calm. "And you aren't leaving. Sit." He gestured not to the corner, but to the chair on his right, the seat Park Do-hyun had occupied just minutes before. The seat of the right hand. Zariah holstered the weapon at the small of her back and walked to the table. She sat down, the leather cool against her skin. It felt forbidden, a violation of the invisible line between server and served. Min-jae slid a glass of water toward her. He studied her face, looking past the uniform, seeing the intelligence burning behind her eyes. "My security team costs me $2 million a year," he said quietly, swirling his glass. "They check for wires. They check for weapons. They check the perimeter. But tonight they were blind. You saw the steam. You saw the sweat. You saw the geometry of the trap. I see what people ignore," Zariah replied, her voice steadying. "It's part of the job." "Not anymore," Min-jae said. He reached into his jacket pocket, a movement that made Zariah flinch, but he pulled out a gold money clip. He didn't open it. He tossed it onto the table, but then he shook his head and pushed it aside. "No. That's for servants. You don't serve me anymore, Zariah." He leaned forward, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "I have enough shooters. I have enough yes-men who smile while they dig my grave. What I don't have is someone who sees the knife before it cuts." He slid the glass of water closer to her, a toast to a new reality. I'm offering you a position. No uniform. No tips. You sit at this table, and you watch the room while I eat. You be my eyes. You be the king's shadow. Zariah looked at the water, then at the empty chair where a traitor had sat, and finally at the man offering her the world. She picked up the glass. To the eyes, she said. Minjay smiled, and for the first time that night, it reached his eyes. To the eyes.